Good morning. Thank you for being here. Let me introduce our guests, and we're just going to launch right in. It's my pleasure to share the stage with two veteran political journalists and observers of the state capitol and great friends for many years. Between them, they have more than 70 years of experience in the news business.
You got the bulk of it.
Yeah, sure. Right. And I think if anybody can make sense of what we've seen over the last 136 days and predict what awaits us in the last 4, it's these two. Ross Ramsey is the Texas Tribune's executive editor, columnist, co-founder, and mother superior. He was previously editor and co-owner of Texas Weekly, the Austin bureau chief of the Dallas Times-Herald, and a reporter for the Houston Chronicle. That doesn't capture everything Ross has done. He had a brief stint on the bad side of the fence working in state government for the comptroller's office, and then we lured him back to the light side. Carlos Sanchez is a senior editor at Texas Monthly. He was previously the top editor at the McAllen Monitor and the Waco Herald Tribune. He's been the state editor of the Austin American-Statesman, was a staff writer for the Washington Post. Give them both a big hand. Thank them for being here.
Thank you.
So let me get the important thing out of the way. There will not be a special session.
I don't think so.
Right?
No, I think Governor Abbott was very strong in his declaration about 3 weeks ago.
Right.
That he had no desire. In fact, that was what precipitated the threat of the nuclear war that came out of the Senate at that point. It was Abbott's intransigence in saying no special session.
We're not going to do it. Ross, we were talking before about what happened on Tuesday night. This has been a session, again, that we'll talk about this, with very few moments of high drama.
Right.
But one of the moments of high drama was on Tuesday night when State Representative and certain delight Jonathan Stickland from Bedford killed a bill that was a priority of the governor's to create a mental health consortium, Senate Bill 10.
This was the mental health thing that grew out of the shootings
in Santa Fe. This was the school safety, big part of the school safety fix. This was a bill that was passed out of the Senate, and he killed it on a point of order. And at that point, people said, uh-oh, there may be a special session, because if we can't somehow figure out a way to resurrect this, the governor may decide to drag everybody back in, and nothing good happens during a special session, right?
Not usually.
Not usually. Right. But they were able to come back and figure out how to get that back to life as an amendment on another bill. And Jonathan Stickland was not very happy about that, because he had thought he had used the rules successfully to kill that bill. And the problem is, if you climb up Rule Book Mountain, you also have to climb down Rule Book Mountain. And they used the rules to get that thing back to life. So no special session, good. So let me ask you guys, first of all, has this been a good session, all things, or a bad session? Has it been a boring session or an exciting session? And are the answers to those two questions related?
They came out at the beginning. They said we're going to do these things: school finance, education, property taxes. And right. Dan Patrick chimed in and said, and a teacher pay raise. And the implication was sort of that they're not going to do much else. They had a bunch of other important stuff. They had all the cleanup stuff from Hurricane Harvey. They had all of the stuff that they wanted to do as a result of school safety.
They have to pass a budget. That's the one thing they have to do.
Pass a budget,
right?
But they sort of, they were sort of implicitly saying, we're not going to do a bathroom bill this session. We're not going to get mired in this or that thing. And, it's probably a great thing. Evan and I have had this conversation for a long time. It's probably a great thing for Texas and a boring thing for journalism.
Terrible thing for journalism.
Right.
Right.
No fights? What, no fighting?
So, Carlos, if you come in and you say you're going to do these things, and then by the end of the session, you've done those things, and we're not there yet, but we're getting there, and you stayed out of troublesome territory, how do you not pronounce that session a success, if that's the thing you're benchmarking against?
Well, I think you are in a position where you're on the eve of pronouncing the session a success. But you also have to recognize that going into the session, the coffers were flush with cash, which makes it a lot easier.
Yeah. Right.
The session for me reminded me of everybody has kids here, the quiet game you play with your kids. It's for 60 seconds, just stay quiet, don't do anything, and
right.
They were almost there, and then right at the very end, they had to come out with some culture war items just to get it out of their system, I guess.
Right.
Go run around the pool 3 times, right?
Yeah. But and of course, the reality is, if you say at the beginning we're going to do property tax reform, we're going to do school finance reform, we're going to pass a budget, that's simple as far as it goes, but it's also unbelievably complicated because the devil is in the details. As we sit here 4 days out, we do not yet have a budget approved. We do not yet have a school finance reform bill approved.
Supposedly, I'm hearing they have a deal this morning.
So you think that as we exit IBC Bank, the skies will light up, the seas will part, and everything will be fine?
This is how deals work at this point. They have a deal at 7:45.
Right.
They might not have a deal at 8:45.
What do they have a deal on? Give us, share. What do they have a deal on specifically?
What I'm hearing is that they basically decided, that part of you're probably hearing the same thing, that
Yes.
part of the conversation about school finance and property taxes has gotten caught by the politics of, it would sure be great if you could lower property taxes. You've got a bunch of product-sensitive people in the legislature. We want better schools. We want, and then you've got a bunch of price-sensitive people. We want taxes to go down. We need something to reward voters. And it goes back to the session being a little bit boring. If you do school finance and you do property tax reform, you can get activists in particular on both sides going, what do I get for that? So what you get for that, is an argument over property taxes. So this deal includes some property tax relief. I don't know how much yet. It includes a teacher pay raise that is not as much as the Senate wanted. This is a little sketchy, but my understanding is it's $5,000 for teachers, that librarians won't get as much, that other school employees won't get as much. And they went the House's way on formulas, which means recapture will go down a little bit.
Which is particularly good for Austin, right?
So they're all kind of getting their pieces, and they'll get a deal.
significant portion is the idea of tying finance to testing.
Right.
It looks like they're going to pull that out, and they're using the Dallas model, or they're looking to use the Dallas model in terms of financing and getting rid of the standardized test as a measure of how much money you'll get.
Right.
And part of the Dallas model is merit pay for teachers, as opposed to
which became controversial after the Texas School Finance Commission recommended in its final report that there be some pay for performance stuff. On the House side of the conversation, at least, that went away because there was a lot of pressure from teachers groups and others who didn't like the idea that you were going to pick winners and losers. The idea was more like middle school field day. Everybody got a ribbon. Right. We're going to give a raise to teachers, good, bad, and in between. And that became itself a flashpoint between the House and the Senate. Right. But you say that's been resolved in favor of...
My understanding, as of, 7:45.
Eddie started this conversation by talking about egos, and I find it interesting here at the end. Yesterday it was in the House chamber. It's House Bill 3 that's kind of the sticking point, the major sticking point.
This is the public ed bill, right?
And there was a real sense of pride among both Democrats and Republicans that the House was holding firm on their position, and that is what was imperiling the discussions.
Right. So this is a $9 billion effort to address school finance, 2/3 of it going into public education directly and 1/3 to buy down property taxes. Again, the thing that I remind people always is
that's how they went in, right.
The state doesn't levy a property tax, so the state can't reduce a property tax. What the state can do is monkey with the mechanism that will then buy down the rate of growth. I mean, it's complicated. At election time, they're all going to say we cut your property taxes. They will all be lying because they didn't actually cut your property taxes, but let's go past that.
This was also the bill that got caught up in the sales tax imbroglio and...
Right. Which let's sort of bookmark that to come back to it, because I think that we're not done with the conversation around the possibility of a swap. That'll just happen after the session is over. But back to the thing on school finance. To Eddie's point, Eddie said he came in '84. They were talking about school finance. I interviewed Speaker Craddock earlier this session for my podcast, who is now in his 51st year in the legislature.
He was elected with Richard Nixon.
The longest.
It was the same election.
Before Richard Nixon was a crook, right? Or we knew it. The longest serving member of the Texas legislature ever. When Tom Craddock was in his 21st year in the legislature, James Tallarico was born, right? That's how long he's been in the legislature. I asked Speaker Craddock what he talked about with his fellow members on the first day in January of 1969. He said school finance reform, right? This is a conversation that we've been talking about forever. And yet, Ross, this is actually, not hype, a significant effort on the part of this legislature to address the problem in a way that they've said they were going to do in the past and actually have not done.
Yeah, they're doing a couple of mechanical things that are really important going forward. One of them is, this ratio of how much is raised locally and how much is raised by the state. Right now, according to the comptroller, is 64% local, 36% state. They'd like to move that toward 50-50. The further that is from 50-50, the greater is our recapture payments from cities, from school systems like Austin, Fort Bend, Plano, Frisco, all of those are sending money. In Austin, I think the last number I heard was 35 cents of your school property taxes go straight to the state. And if you even that up,
right,
those things kind of go away. The other thing is real subtle, but it's really important. They haven't redone the weights, what they call the weights. You know, they say, here's an average kid, whatever an average kid is, we're going to give them $1. This kid has ESL needs, this one has special needs, this one has this, so this one's $1.05, this one's $1.10, and they haven't sort of redone all of those weights for a long time.
Right.
And it's significant in a lot of districts, particularly as you get, you know, you got a great deal more kids on school lunch programs, and that affects performance. And, you know, the money has been distributed according to a formula adopted when Eddie got here, and they're changing those formulas now. So there's a lot of stuff down in the wiring that over time is going to, they hope, will keep this from going to court so often.
Carlos, that, to Ross's point about the division of funding of schools, state versus local, even this $9 billion only gets the state's share of funding of public ed to about 40 or 41%, right? We're not even close to 50%.
You know, there's an interesting term that is coming about that the last time I heard it was when Rick Perry was governor and he was pushing for property tax reform. It's called structural deficit. And it looks like we're facing, at this point right now, unless significant changes happen with House Bill 3, a structural deficit. So we're flush with cash now. We can throw some cash to alleviate some of your property tax, but any permanent source of revenue doesn't exist.
Yeah, and the $9 billion that is going in through a combination of public school finance and property tax buy down has to go into this budget. I mean, pardon me, if it goes into this budget, it has to go into each budget in successive years, right? I mean, something we're not talking about is that they're not only committing to spend that now, they're effectively committing to spend it in future years.
Well, and the whole system is based on the idea, sort of implicitly, that real estate values never go down, right? Ever. And so property values never go down, and so property taxes never go down, and so these formulas are always going to work. You know, what actually happens, we're in a long rise, everybody knows that, but the minute they dip a little bit, this structural deficit becomes the whole story.
Right. So the big sticking points on the public, before we move on to the property taxes, the big sticking points on the public school finance bill were the allotments,
right?
How much we're going to do per student. The question of current year versus prior year values, as the
which property values you use to put the formulas together,
and the teacher pay stuff. There was some accountability stuff, testing, we mentioned, and all that. But while these are significant individually, in the grand scheme of things with the bill, they're sort of down to the 2-yard line here. I mean, they're pretty close. And as you say, they may have gotten the ball over, which will be significant. Dan Huberty, the chair of the Public Education Committee in the House, and Larry Taylor in the Senate, they've actually really legitimately pulled something off.
Yeah. This is usually done in the face of a court ruling. You know, when the legislature, it's like there's this sort of, I think of it as a triangle. You can either lower what you spend on public education, you can raise how much the state spends, or you can raise how much you spend locally. And they're all politically unpleasant things, and they've typically only done one of those things. It's typically raised state spending in the face of court decisions. And otherwise, and then they can go home and say, you know, I didn't want to do that, but, you know, the courts. This time they're doing it without the courts. So the significant thing is that they feel significant enough pressure when they go to town hall meetings and hear about property taxes and hear about schools that they're doing something without waiting for the Supreme Court to come in.
There's another key component of change that's happening. I mean, what we're describing here is political change. I also think there's some philosophical change going on, specifically as it relates to the willingness to raid the rainy day fund. That had been sacrosanct for so long.
Absolutely, yeah. The legislature has this session unclutched its pearls.
It has, and my understanding is part of this HB3 solution may be dipping in a bit further into the rainy day fund to pay down some of the property tax relief.
So the property tax problem, Carlos, that they were trying to solve, the threshold had been for many years 8%. If property tax values or property tax revenue year over year was higher than 8%, voters had a mechanism to collect signatures and get an up or down on the ballot.
Correct.
What was in play last session and again this session was somehow lowering that threshold and making the sort of sending this to the voters an automatic, not having to collect signatures, but just basically streamlining the process so that voters would be brought into the conversation. So the fight last session was over 4% and 6%. They couldn't compromise. Things didn't happen. They came back and started at 2.5%. It looks like now that threshold will be 3.5% for most or all entities. That's still one of the things to be worked out in the conference committee. Right. So local officials caterwauled about the idea that 3.5% was going to hamstring their ability to pay for critical services provided locally, but the legislature said we know better.
And that's the interesting kind of fight that's going on. As we think of property taxes, we're always thinking in terms of school funding, because that's the bulk of your property taxes. But the cities and the counties are the ones who are raising some real concerns about this 2.5% and 3.5% threshold is not going to allow them to keep up with growth that's happening in the fastest growing
The mayor of Austin did the math for me, and again, people challenge him on this, so I'm not accepting his version of the facts. I'm simply restating what he said. His version of the facts is that half of his revenue comes in the form of property tax collections. And if the property tax collections are limited to 2.5%, which was when we started talking about it, or 3.5%, his costs, particularly on public safety, are going up year over year higher than that threshold.
And public safety is usually about 2/3 of their budget.
And he fears that if that threshold is put in place, short of going to the voters and asking for more revenue, that he may actually be at risk of having to cut public safety. The legislature called bullshit on that. They said, nope. That you're saying that, you're creating this straw man.
Well, what they
but
said
the reality is we don't believe that you have as much of a problem in your budget as you say you do.
Well, what they said was, if you go to your voters and say, hey, we can't raise this, we can't open another fire station unless you let us have another tax rate.
Or we have to
and you
lose
explain
public
it, then the voters
safety.
will say, okay, raise the tax.
Or we have to lose cops or lose firefighters
Right.
if you don't give us the ability to get access to more money. Just make the case to voters. Right. So this is going to happen, right? There's no question about this.
Yeah, unless they fumble. They could fumble.
They could fumble, but yes, this is, I think, something that's off the table
But
right
it's going to get done. So, interestingly enough, you described this as the quiet game session.
Yes.
I had somebody the other day describe this to me as the Seinfeld session. This was the session about nothing. The other side of, look at what they did, they sort of acted like adults, they stayed on all their issues, they didn't get distracted by controversies, is that unless you were living in the realm of public school finance or property taxes, no one would pay attention to you. If you were transportation, if you were healthcare, if you were other significant issues that take up a significant chunk of state spending, you raised your hand, you stamped your feet, you shouted out loud, no one would pay attention to you this session. Now, there's a good aspect of that, right? Being ignored is the same as being left alone.
Right.
But did we not focus on things that we should have focused on in this session in favor of sticking to the script?
Well, they had two things. One of the things Carlos mentioned that's really important here is that the day before the session, the controller, Glenn Hager, came out and said, you got about $9 billion more than you had when you started 2 years ago.
Right.
So
and he's since bumped that up another $500 million.
And then he added a $500 million, and they've got a couple of other things that are going to add a little bit more. There's plenty of money this time as things go. And so there was less pressure on, the budget wrote pretty well. They're on the verge of approving their first $250 billion
$250 billion budget, right, which is a huge increase over last time.
Right. It's a big increase. So a lot of what you're talking about got hidden in there. A lot of people that didn't make a bunch of noise to get funding got funding without making a lot of money.
Yeah, but did we make progress on solving the state's transportation problems this session in any material way? Did we make progress on solving the state's growing problem of people not having access to health insurance or doctors, and particularly kids who are not insured? Did we make any progress on just those two big ticket items this session?
If you look at it from one perspective, absolutely not. Yeah. But then, just 24 hours ago, the Senate passed an expanded medical marijuana bill, which was kind of an extraordinary step forward. Again, philosophically.
Well, I mean, it was an expanded medical marijuana bill, but it's the CBD oil, right? This is not joints for everybody, right? This is... I mean, we haven't turned into Colorado overnight.
Yeah, you look at the package, I don't feel anything.
Although I will accept the fact that the words Donna Campbell and marijuana now will for all time appear in the same sentence, which I don't think I would have predicted before this.
I think they changed some of the formula funding in the Medicaid program. Some of the federal matches are better this time. Some of those things got funded quietly that usually only get funded after a bunch of noise making. And I think it's mainly because funding was available in a way that it hadn't been before.
So as we come out of this, I want to talk about the principles in a second, the big three. But as we come out of the session, Carlos brought up the sales tax before. So there was briefly a moment of where there was a talk of raising the sales tax by a penny.
Correct.
For the purpose of putting some initially and then eventually all of that money into buying down property taxes. The left hated it because below $100,000 annual household income per household, they were going to get hit harder. It was a regressive tax. The left did not like it because it was a regressive tax. The right did not like it because you suddenly had the spectacle of Republicans being in the business of advocating for property tax, for tax increases.
Right.
Even though that money was going to go to buy down the property tax, all they heard was the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker are raising your taxes, right? So this did not happen. They did not have the votes for this. But there's some discussion that it will happen going forward.
Ross mentioned something about how things change so easily in 24 hours. There was a period, and this was the day that was marked when the Big Three had that last press conference,
Right.
where the leadership sincerely believed that they had the votes in both
They
chambers.
could get it done.
And then something happened.
I think they were the only three in the room who believed they had the votes. But
Right.
yeah.
And it was scattered. I mean, it was, what's his name with the Facebook message? The sponsor of House Bill 2, of Senate Bill 2.
Burroughs.
No.
Betancourt.
Betancourt.
Oh, sorry.
Right.
He went on
The other
Facebook.
Facebook message.
Yes.
Yeah.
He went on Facebook Live railing against the penny increase on a sales tax. And that caused the right to bolt, and the left immediately saw the same thing, and they bolted.
But the theory, Carlos, is that just as school finance was the big issue of the interim this last time, and there was a commission put in place to study the problem, and then eventually that was the catalyst for the action in the session, there is a discussion now that the interim will be taken up with a commission of some kind on new revenue sources
Right.
heading into the next session, and one of those could be a revival of this sales tax for property tax swap. That is not a dead issue, at least as far as the next session
It's,
goes.
it's like a giant perennial crackpot idea that you can get rid of the whole tax system and replace it with another tax system that everybody will like. You'll take a whole tax system.
Well, in fact, Glenn Hager has advocated in the past, when he was
Right.
running the first time for controller, for getting rid of the property tax entirely and replacing it entirely with a consumption tax.
Right. It's about, if you get rid of the property tax for M&O, for maintenance and operations for schools, it's about $60 billion. So the first problem is, hey, you got rid of that, everybody's happy, now you got to find $60 billion. If you do that with consumption taxes, you have to essentially triple the sales tax. So now you're at 18. People are going to be buying refrigerators in Louisiana, I think, or New Mexico.
Right, I'm looking at one friend in particular in the room who I will try not to lock eyes with, who is in the retail business, who might think this is a terrible idea.
Right. So there's that way to go. There's
Terrible.
one of Texas's great political glories is that we don't have an income tax, and we're never going to have one. And when we poll it, it's a little bit below colon cancer.
Right. And they just passed yet another bill to outlaw something that was
Right.
already outlawed.
So-
they just shot a dead corpse yesterday with the income tax bill.
Although,
So
Adam, that's a significant bill. There's something in there that really is kind of a hidden.
Right, so you've written and we've written that the bill that they just passed to outlaw the thing that was already outlawed, it's like a bill to outlaw murder, to outlaw the income tax, has a potential trigger in it that could also reduce significantly the business tax, right?
Right.
Absolutely, and it's a single word. It's individual versus what is it?
Natural person.
Natural
versus-
person.
The authors of that bill have pushed back strenuously against the suggestion that bill could have a tripwire in it.
It's the
But
Mitt
what
Romney
we'll
rule.
see.
It's the corporations are people too, my friend. And
Right.
and if you do that to tax law, basically if you say natural person, it's somebody can wear a coat. If it's an individual, it can be Exxon.
Let me ask each of you quickly, other than the sales tax, what is a big issue that you think rolls forward into the interim that we're going to be spending our time talking about for the next 2 years?
I think everybody in politics is going to be preoccupied, regardless of what we're talking about, with redistricting.
Right, heading in.
Redistricting. It's interesting. That was one of the big things that I know the caucuses of color were really interested in is the census and how we were going to handle the census, and it just disappeared from the session. So,
Well, the fact is the state can't have any, the state doesn't have anything to do with what ultimately is decided by the Census Bureau and the Commerce Department about the citizenship question or about anything else, right? We don't really have in the legislature an ability to affect that particular part.
Other than the marketing component,
Right.
talking about how important it is.
And there
Which is
has
a
been
big
a
deal in getting
discussion.
people counted.
There has been a discussion of the fact that the state has not spent any money to promote participation in the census the
Right.
way other states have. That's for sure. All right, so let's ask about the big three. We had a new speaker.
Yep.
First open speakers race in 25 years. Turned out to be kind of a nothing burger speakers race, right? Bonin had it locked
Yes.
up before it even got interesting. Grade the new speaker.
I think he had a great first session. One of the things that happened the other night, subtle thing, but it was important in the House, was when Jonathan Stickland brought up a point of order challenging the process on a bill that was important to everybody. I mean, the sponsorships on that school safety mental health bill were all royalty. It was the head of finance, the head of appropriations, everybody was for it. And Bonin had told people that we're going to honor the rules in the House and we're going to play by the rules strictly, even when we don't like it. And allowing that bill to fall on that rule was a clear signal to the House, wow, he really meant it.
It was suggested to me, Carlos, that in the old days, which is to say the Strauss era,
Right.
he would have overruled the point of order, even though the rules might have been in favor of the point of order, that this was a new day.
You know, I'm going to get back to you with the really old days. I was asking a lot of House members, both Republican and Democrat, about their opinion of Bonin, and they were comparing it to the Laney era, in which let the House's will dictate what we do, and he seemed to be fairly free.
That
in
was a
front.
favorable comparison.
Yes, it was.
So in the old days when I ran Texas Monthly and I edited 13 best and worst stories over the years I was there, I am the Joe DiMaggio of editing best and worst stories. My record will never be broken. There was a rule unspoken about putting leadership on the list. This would be a year, I was thinking to myself, kind of scratching at that old memory, it would be hard not to put the speaker on the best list this year.
And that was another fascinating component of my exploration in the House. Again, I asked Democrats and Republicans, and to a person, their recommendation for someone to be put on the best list was Bonin.
Was Bonin. So did Dan Patrick have a worse session? I realized that he won re-election by 5 points as opposed to 19 points, and I realized that unlike the last few sessions, he was not able to roll the House, or at least up to this point. The Senate has not been in the dominant position that it has been in the past.
Well, I think he was unable to roll the Senate in the way that he has.
That's an interesting observation. Talk about that.
He's always had very good, agree or don't agree with him, he's always had very, very good control of the Texas Senate. He's kind of got the Senate Bob Bullock always wanted. He's really in control of it. They go his way. There's a lot of 31-0 votes that come screaming out of there. And then they hold together against the House, and he's always been in a powerful position. This time he starts by not even being there on the first day. He was in Washington doing some stuff at the White House. There have been things during the session where he was out of position. There have been places where the Senate might have been represented that it wasn't, and I just think he seems distracted and the man who wasn't there to me.
Carlos, he couldn't control the Senate, Ross says. He couldn't even control Paul Betancourt. That's like Charlie McCarthy telling Edgar Bergen to stick it. Right? I mean, he couldn't.
Who are
even,
these people, old man?
Right? Yeah. He couldn't. Yeah. Young people have no idea what I'm talking about. Edgar Bergen was Candace Bergen's dad. You don't even know who Candace Bergen is.
Who's Candace Bergen?
Right. Carlos, I mean, even Betancourt revolted against.
Well, because there's kind of a lack of complete understanding, people will inject an explanation. So he's disengaged much of the session, and people are saying automatically that's because he's going to the White House. He's going to get a cabinet position.
Yeah.
And that rumor just keeps repeating itself and coming back. And it is of note that he missed the first day of the session.
Right.
It is of note that his top legislative priority, the property tax, Senate Bill 2, when it was scheduled to be debated, he again was with Trump.
I thought he was on Laura Ingraham down in the Valley. Well, he was on
He's
Fox,
been
right?
on Laura Ingraham for almost a dozen times this session, talking about border security and little else.
Yeah, I think a lot of the reason that the rumor has persisted, he says it's not true. There's no reason not to believe him, except that you keep having these things. Well, then where are you?
Yes.
Right? It's sort of how do you explain his kind of lack of presence in this thing? And it's interesting that. So what this has done is if you watch the big three, it's always 2-1 some kind of way, right? And it has been the lieutenant governor and the governor against the House, against Strauss. And this time it's, I think it's much more Bonin and Abbott
Yes.
against the Senate. And,
Right.
that shift is odd.
So speaking of the governor, so I remember very clearly at the end of last session, 2017, walking between the Austin Club and Starbucks, conventional wisdom alley, right, on Congress Avenue, and running into a very conservative member of the legislature who said, I was like, well, how's it going? He said, he's like the governor. I was like, what do you mean? He said, he's not Governor Abbott, he's governor absent. Mm-hmm. He was complaining about the fact that there had been all these disputes between the House and the Senate, and that the governor had chosen to stay out of them until very late or entirely, and basically had not been a force for good or a force at all in the session. That's also different this session, right? The governor has been much more engaged.
I would give him the moniker most improved this session.
Right.
He gets the blue ribbon, best handwriting.
Well, but don't you think he made a decision at the beginning to assert his views on the big issues that were going to be before the legislature? He stayed engaged. He was constantly on the floor of the House and Senate lobbying. Of course, he wouldn't talk to reporters. Let's not get crazy.
We don't have any
but
votes.
He was on the floor of the House and the Senate consistently over the course of the session. He was involved. His staff was involved. It was a new day, was it not?
Yes, he's been very engaged this session, and it's a stark contrast to people noticing the disengagement of the lieutenant governor.
Right. Same.
Right. Yeah, I think so. Part of it was he had a staff change, and these things are important. They're subtle, but they're important. And he put 3 people in his staff in particular who are old hands. One of the marks of the Abbott administration has been that they weren't great at legislative politics because they didn't have any experience at it. And they brought in a former senator, Tommy Williams. They brought in Walter Fisher, who's one of the sort of great Jedis of legislative politics, and they brought in Louise Sines, who really understands this stuff upside down. And I think you can see their understanding in both Abbott's presence on the floor and when he's present. It's pretty strategic. Get out there now, talk to them about this, pull out. It's a very organized and I think effective way to do this. He's had priorities at the beginning of every session. He comes out at the beginning of every one of his sessions.
Here are the items, right.
He does the State of the State speech. He says this and this and this and this and this, and then it rolls off the table and you're done. And this time they rolled it out, as you said. They did it at the mansion. They did it again in the speech. Mm-hmm. And then they came back, and then they came back, and then they came back, and then they came back. And part of it was keep your eye on this. Right. Don't mess with that. And they've just been effective.
And I think there was an element of empowerment, too. I'm hearing he's much more assertive, particularly with his relationship with Dan Patrick. I think because he has a sense that Bonin may have his back on that front.
Yeah. Right. So one theory of the case is these guys started out with an idea in mind, what they wanted to accomplish. They stuck to the script. They worked it really hard. They got it done. That's the kind of noble public servants, they're kind of working on all behalf. The second theory of the case is that the voters delivered a message in the last election. We're pissed. We're giving you 2 years to get your acts together, and if you don't, we're coming for you. And so that what you saw in the last election was the voters asserting themselves in a way that forced everybody, Abbott, Patrick, the House and the Senate, to stay in line, to get in line, and that all this is a pragmatic response to a persistent threat from the voters. What do you think about that?
It's an interesting theory, particularly looking at how quiet for most of the session the social conservatives were. They took the biggest beating last election, and they came in looking very humbled and chastised.
Yeah.
They reared their head right toward the end, but I think for the most part, that theory would hold up with regard to how their behavior was.
Right, and the fact is, Ross, Abbott and Patrick are not on the ballot next time. All 150 members of the House will be.
Right.
A certain number of the members of the Senate will be, but nobody is worried about the Senate flipping from Republican to Democrat. No one is worried about the presidential race in Texas being won by Democrats. If the Democrats nominate Jose Altuve and J.J. Watt as their ticket, this state will not be competitive. The reality is no concern about that. John Cornyn's race is his race to lose.
Right.
Yes.
So in some ways, a lot of this election threat for the next cycle is not really much of a threat. Although I guess the concern that they all have up the street is that the Texas House as strange as it would have been even a year ago for us to be saying this, the Texas House is legitimately at risk of flipping. It's not a huge risk, but it's a risk.
Yeah, they've got a couple of things going on. 2018 was weird because all of these people showed up who don't ordinarily show up. They got a presidential level turnout, and they got a vote that looked more like a presidential year. It's a little bit less Republican. It's not Democratic, but it's a little bit less Republican.
I don't think people fully appreciate. There were 4.7 million Texans who turned out in the 2014 midterm.
Right.
And there were 8.3 million who turned out in the 2018 midterm, higher than the presidential year turnout of 2012 and approaching the 2016 turnout.
Right. So they won a couple of seats that nobody expected them to win. They won 5 to 7 more in the Texas House than a conservative estimate would have said. They won congressional seats, they won a couple of Senate seats, and everybody kind of went, wait a minute, what was that? Right now it's just one data point. So if you go forward and you say, okay, should we be nervous about that? And Dan Patrick winning by less than 5 points probably came out of that nervous. And then they look at, part of this is whatever was going on that year, and one of the things going on that year was Donald Trump. Donald Trump is on the ballot in 2020. So
he was existentially on the ballot last time. He's actually on the ballot this time.
If this data point is something we should be concerned about, then we should be concerned about the election ahead. They're probably going to lose congressional seats in Texas. They could lose a couple of seats in the House. I think they're going to lose one seat in the Senate. Flores is a Republican in a very Democratic area.
Right. Never underestimate the ability of Democrats in San Antonio to blow an election.
That was the asterisk I was about to put on that. So they've got some things in play. The congressional maps are really what they're worried about in the redistricting fight in 2021. The legislative maps are going to be drawn ultimately, if they need to be, by Republicans on the Legislative Redistricting Board, and those guys are already elected.
Yeah, but having having a Democratic speaker as part of this effort on redistricting
wouldn't matter.
It wouldn't matter, but nonetheless, there's enough of a concern about the House flipping for that, as it relates to redistricting. I mean, people are concerned about that legitimately.
They're legitimately concerned about it flipping. I think last election, the House got a net gain of 12 Democratic seats.
Democrats need 9 seats net to take back control of the House and presumably elect a speaker. We know which 9 seats. There are more than 9 Republican seats that, under the right circumstances, could flip, but there were also a couple of seats that the Democrats won this last time that could flip back.
There's 5 to 7 seats in play the other way. Altogether, there's 31 of the 150 House districts were won by statewide officials on one side or the other by less than 10 points. So any given year, depending on how competitive they are, depending on how goofy your candidates are or how great they are. So, that's 31 things in play.
Yeah. Eddie, can we go to, where'd Eddie go? Let's go to questions.
Yeah, Andy's good.
Okay. We have questions come in from some other places, and we'll take questions in the room also, right? Yeah. So let's start off with a question from another location. So David Whitley is the appointee of the governors to the Secretary of State's office at the beginning of the year. If he does not get approved by Monday, he is out.
You want to do the Roman version?
We can do that.
Yeah.
Although his presence has had a real interesting effect in the late days here of ensuring that the Democrats are in the chamber in the Senate.
Show up for work.
Right. So people understand Whitley was the Secretary of State whose office released.
He still is.
But whose office released the list of supposed non-eligible voters, right?
Correct.
Right.
Which was blown up. And Whitley has to go through the confirmation process through the nominations committee, which actually supported his nomination, but the vote has never made it to the floor. And
it takes 2/3 to win.
It takes 2/3 to win confirmation for that office, which means no Democrat can have a bathroom break.
Correct.
Right?
You need
because
2 Democrats.
2/3 on the floor.
2/3 on the floor,
On
correct.
the floor. So if any Democrats go to the bathroom,
Right.
there may be an opportunity to approve this guy, but it's not going to happen.
There were some strong rumors on Sunday, a day that a lot of people tend to call in sick when the Senate was in chamber, that they might try to pull the Whitley nomination off on that day, but the Democrats showed up in full force.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. There was a theory that the closer margin, 83-67 this time instead of 95-55 last time, would change the way the House operated. Do you see that?
Yeah, I think it's moderated some of the votes. I think, it determined who the speaker is. One of the things that Bonin did without upsetting the Republicans, he presented a case that was acceptable to the Democrats. One of the things, Strauss's original sin was that he won initially with renegade Republicans and most of the Democrats, even though he was a Republican. He won 4 elections after that with all the Republicans. But that didn't count for him. In Bonin's case, he had something of the same math to conquer. I've got to have Democrats on this thing or I'm not going to win. But he did it in a way that, I'm going to take care of the Republicans, but I'm going to not hurt the Democrats. We're going to do that with this rules thing. And I think, he's been sort of moderate about what they've had to vote on. There have been some tough votes, especially in the last 2 or 3 weeks, but not really the ordinary number of them and not sort of the building tension that you get usually in a legislative session through the month of April. And,
And there was the brokered piece with the Chick-fil-A bill that happened.
Right.
There was
They
apparently...
didn't have to vote on elections.
Yes.
Right.
It flared up. The Democrats and Republicans agreed that this bill would be debated. Everybody would kind of go through it, and then they would quiet down and move on.
Right. The bill that ultimately passed, the so-called Chick-fil-A bill, was a watered-down version of the bill as it was originally written. The fact is that paid sick leave, if you had told me at the beginning of this session that paid sick leave would not be undone by this legislature, and that was a layup. They tripped over themselves on non-discrimination ordinances, but they didn't do that. They didn't get rid of taxpayer-funded lobbying for municipalities.
Correct.
There was, relatively speaking, a lot of things that could have happened didn't. And then the voting rights bill, SB 9, it still could be amended onto something, but in all likelihood, if you're a Democrat and you stand back and you say, how bad was this session for our side or people who think like us?
Right.
It was not as bad as it could have been.
Right.
And that does probably have to do with the numbers, right?
Right. Some of it's temper and some of it's substance. They didn't have a sanctuary cities bill this time. They didn't have, all of the things that have flared this before. And the House, the sick leave bill is a great example. The Senate's originally filed sick leave bill, I think, would have sailed through the Senate and sailed through the House. Sailed through the governor, bada bing, bada boom. And somewhere early in the Senate, they removed these non-discrimination ordinances and made it about something else. And a House that wasn't accommodating Democrats would have blown through that. But the House was and did, and that was the end of that bill. Andy might have a different version of this, but that's my version of this, is that had they left that thing alone in a form that even some Democrats were like, yeah, okay, let that go. But they lit up NDOs, and Bonin basically stepped in for the House and said, we're not going to.
Well, and the Chair of State Affairs, in fact, first and foremost, said, I'm going to reinsert the NDO language into the version of the bill that came over from the Senate because, as he said to me specifically, this is 2019. I'm tired of bashing on the gay community.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It's totally unacceptable. This is the conservative chair of the State Affairs Committee from Beaumont, and he said if the Senate returns through conference committee the NDO language stripped out, I'm not voting for this bill, Chair of State Affairs. The bill was effectively dead at that moment.
Right.
Exactly.
Right? And so the idea that this legislature, which had more than enough Republican votes to get rid of paid sick leave, did not, is a sign that maybe, in fact, the numbers changed. You want to take questions from outside? Anybody talk about windstorm insurance really in any material way this session?
I think the one time, there's always at least one vote in the House where you go in and you look at the House at the beginning of the thing and you say, okay, they're going to vote this way. And then somebody goes up to speak and talks for a minute and you go, I think that just flipped the vote. And it happened when Todd Hunter went to the mic on windstorms. It's like the world's most boring issue. It's a classic perennial fight between John Smithy in the Panhandle and Todd Hunter from Corpus, who are both really good friends, but this is, they have different interests in this. Why are we paying for them to live on the coast and get hit by hurricanes? Well, why are we paying for them to live up there and get hit by the high winds on the plains and tornadoes? It's a factional war, but Todd Hunter stood up and basically went into Southern preacher mode and flipped the House and turned that vote around, and it was a really interesting moment. They were going to pass a bill that cut Corpus and the coast out on this windstorm stuff, cut them out on rates, cut them out on the study that they were doing, all of this stuff. He went up and flipped it, and so they're back in the game.
One other component of it that's interesting is Todd Hunter lost his chairmanship, and he could have spent the session sulking.
Yeah, sucking his thumb.
But a lot of people said he had a really good session, and this is one example of why he had a good session.
Right. Well, in fact, part of we don't have time to get into it too much, but part of the untold story of the session are the people who were put in timeout effectively for backing the wrong horse in the speaker's race. Right. And there were people who came into the session kind of hangdog, forlorn. We're not going to really get the opportunity to be participants, but whether it was Ashby or Hunter or Sarah Davis or Drew Darby or Travis Clardy, they didn't just disappear for the whole session.
Players are still players.
Players are still players. That happens, right? Take one from inside the room. Don't you think, you guys, that so to Mr. Doherty's, Commissioner Doherty's question, the challenge for Democrats in some ways is to do at the presidential level what Beto O'Rourke did in the Senate race. You don't have to win, you just have to get it to be close.
Right.
And if you lose, you beat a bunch of Republicans in the process. O'Rourke's race, 2.5%, 2.6%, was 90% better than what Cornyn did against David Alamil in 2014. Cornyn won by 26 points. Cruz won by 2.6.
The long-lost David Alamil.
It was the closest Senate race in Texas in 40 years since John Hill was elected to the Senate in 1978. And by doing that, by keeping the race so close, he beat a bunch of Republicans down ballot. Trump beat Clinton by 9. Closest presidential race in Texas since Bob Dole beat the other Clinton in 1996 by 5.
Right.
Romney had won by 16, McCain had won by 11. If the Democrats were able to keep the presidential race to, Carlos, 5 or 6, don't you think Commissioner Doherty has reason to be concerned for what happens to his party all along the ballot elsewhere?
I think that's a reading that is happening both at the local and the national level. For the first time, the DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, is actually spending money in Texas.
They've opened an office right here in Austin, right?
And they're targeting at least 5 congressional seats. And they're very active. I get a press release a day from the DCCC talking about what was done here or what was done there.
Right.
And the hope is that this will force Trump to spend some money in Texas during 2020. So I think it's already, you're seeing some movement forward.
It matters who the ticket is, though, certainly. If it's Elizabeth Warren and Michael Avenatti, then I think we have a different right? We have a different conversation.
Right.
But there are a number of, I mean, what if it's Vice President Biden?
Well, I mean, this is
Kamala
kind of what I was
Harris,
talking
right?
about with 2018. You get this one data point where everybody looks at it and says, you know, it's that moment in A Christmas Carol where you look up and say, is this the future that will be or the future that might be, right? And the future that might be is 2018 all over again, where you get a close race somewhere toward the top of the ticket, and it pulls into contention races that otherwise weren't in contention. Beto O'Rourke should have gotten roses from at least 7 new members of the Texas House, a couple new members of the Texas Senate, and 3 people who ran for Congress. You know, thanks for getting me over the line, sorry you didn't make it. And the Democrats are looking for a ticket, whether they find one or not is a wide open question with 24 candidates. We're looking for a ticket that pulls things like that together. They're also looking at, you know, a Senate race where is there some way to pull the Cornyn race into as close a contest, as competitive and interesting and exciting to voters a contest as the Cruz-O'Rourke race was. And from here, it doesn't look like it. But I will also say that from here, it didn't look like O'Rourke versus Cruz was anything.
Right. The conventional, Carlos, the conventional wisdom is Cornyn is not Cruz.
Correct.
And the conventional wisdom is that any of the people who is now currently talking about the race on the Democratic side is not Beto. But we forget that at this point in the year prior to the election, Beto was not Beto. Right? I mean, what we've learned after the last election cycle is we don't know what the hell we're talking about.
Well, the first polling in the Cruz race was Cruz versus O'Rourke was a surprisingly close race, within 10 points, say. And nobody knew who O'Rourke was. Yes. So basically you have a result that says Cruz versus not Cruz is a competitive race, right? Cornyn versus not Cornyn is not as competitive a race. So the fill-in-the-blank candidate doesn't immediately start, I think in my own mind, just analyzing this race, you start with sort of a typical Democratic performance unless something happens, 43 to 45% by fill in the name of whoever the Democratic candidate is. But if you have other things going on, Trump could pull this close. Yeah. The races below could pull this close. If all the Dan Patrick rumors turn into real life, and we have a lieutenant governor's race in 2020. That pulls it close. The question really is, 2020 going to be like 2018 in competitive?
Carlos, on your DCCC point?
Yes.
So let me just ask you guys, yes or no? Just one word answer, yes or no. Is the Mike McCall congressional race legitimately in play, yes or no?
Yes.
Ish. That's not yes or no, Ross. Follow my damn instructions.
I'm taking ish.
Ish. Is the Chip Roy race, which was the closest race, and I'm, again, trying not to look back at the losing candidate in that race who had the closest of the congressional races that did not win, is Chip Roy's race legitimately competitive, yes or no?
Yes.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be in that district. If you look at that district up until this last race, it's pretty solidly Republican.
Is Wendy Davis going to run for that seat, delivering the press its dream of abortion Barbie versus pro-life Ken? Isn't that what that race is going to be distilled down to if that happens?
He writes the headlines.
Right? I mean, aren't we talking about like that becomes a marquee? She gets in that race, that becomes a nationalized race, doesn't it?
Yeah, it gets some attention.
Is
the
Kenny
question
Mo-
is, she gets the same question she got in her race for governor. Everybody knows who you are. What are you going to do with it?
Right. What else you got? Is Kenny Marchant's seat legitimately competitive?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Should Will Hurd update his LinkedIn?
Yeah, he's been a very good candidate in a district he shouldn't be winning.
You know, what you're pointing out, Evan, is the notion that, a year and a half ago, there didn't look to be much of a bench on the Democratic side. Now we seem to see a bigger bench.
Signs of life.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, let me, you got to wrap? Okay, Eddie said we got to wrap up. Please thank Ross and Carlos coming to spend time with us. At the end of the session, Bob, thank you. IBC, thank you. We'll see you guys then.